Hello, my name is Dr. Sandra Rain, and I'm the Associate Dean Research at Augustana Faculty at the University of Alberta, located in the province of Alberta in Canada, and I am very pleased to be able to share with you some of my thoughts about Canada's recent 2021 election, and I'll be asking if this was a necessary election in Canada.
Buenas tardes, les traigo saludos de la Universidad de Alberta. Desafortunadamente no podemos estar ahí en persona este año, pero espero que este saludo en mis esquís en mi región de Alberta es una forma de decirles hola. Soy Carsten Munder. Soy el principal del rector con cargo a aprendizaje experimental por toda la Universidad de Alberta. Estamos muy alegres que este año podemos estar ahí con ustedes, con Dr. Sandra Rain y los estudiantes que van a llegar en enero del año siguiente. Espero que su congreso es un éxito. He realmente disfrutado mi participación en su congreso en los años que he estado la oportunidad y espero que este año es otra vez un gran éxito para todos ustedes. Otra vez, abrazos de Canadá y espero que les encuentro en un tiempo próximo.
Thank you, Dr. Mundell. As you can see, we are enjoying winter in Canada, and Dr. Mundell recorded that from a rural location located in Treaty 6. And before I proceed to my presentation, I wanted to share with you our statement of acknowledgement of traditional territory. So when professors from the University of Alberta give presentations, we like to acknowledge the traditional and Indigenous lands where we work, and this is something that Canada is doing as part of a small act of recognition and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples given a very violent and difficult past. So, before I continue, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which I work is traditionally known as Assiniquojah Sepisis, also Stony Creek, is Treaty 6 territory and a traditional meeting ground for many Indigenous peoples. This is the land upon which the Augustana campus of the University of Alberta is located. Historically, it provided a traveling route and home to the Maskwacis Nahiawak, Niitsitapi, Nakota, and Tsuut'ina nations, the Métis and other Indigenous people. Their spiritual and practical relationships to the land create a rich heritage for our learning and for our life as a community. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share that acknowledgement, and I look forward to an opportunity when we are in person again to talk more about Canada's Indigenous peoples and the University of Alberta's commitment to reconciliation. Turning to today, I want to talk about Canada's federal elections. Many of you will know a little bit about Canada and our system of government, but I want to just take a few moments to give you some context for what has happened recently, and we have to actually start in 2015 for it to make a lot of sense. So historically, a parliamentary system like Canada's held elections every 5 years at the outset. But it was actually up to the government of the day to determine the best time to call an election. This allowed for all kinds of strategy and planning on the parts of government, but it didn't always let Canadians know when they could expect an election, and sometimes made elections look more like they were merely opportunities rather than discussions in democratic practice. So, in a way to try to address some of the practical elements, in 2007, Canada chose to implement a system of set election dates. Now, this doesn't mean you can't have an election sooner than 4 years, but it does mean practically that the dates were set and known every 4 years. Now, some suggested that the Prime Minister of the day, Stephen Harper, who brought in our set election date legislation, also had opportunistic reasons or political strategy reasons for wanting this. Either way, since 2007, Canadians have had a little bit of more predictability about their elections. In 2015, we had a federal election, and it turned out to be an excellent outcome for then Liberal Party leader Justin Trudeau. So the Liberal Party won a majority of seats in that election. In fact, numerically, they won more seats to turn a majority than any government previously in history. So this was a very, very big win. There was a lot of celebration around the leader, Justin Trudeau, who was seen to be young and energetic and sort of the new face of Canada, coming off of some minority governments led by Stephen Harper, who was seen to be very, very conservative and maybe not in touch with where Canadians were at the time. So there was a lot of celebration. And for people who wanted to see Canada move towards more progressive policies that were focused more on families and people who were working, they thought that this was going to be a very, very good government. And in fact, the Prime Minister of the day for the first time ensured that there was gender balance in his cabinet, and there really seemed to be an upbeat feeling, not among conservatives perhaps, but among people who saw themselves as liberal or even more to the left in Canada. So a lot of hope was vested in this election and in this leader. So in Canada, we follow what is known as a parliamentary system, or the Westminster tradition. And many of you will have heard of this. It comes from Canada's colonial past and our relationship with the United Kingdom. And Westminster is actually a title drawn from the Palace of Westminster, where Parliament resides in London, England. What is most interesting for us today is how a government comes to be either a majority, that is holding the most seats and governing, or a government that is called a minority, so it doesn't have an absolute majority, but does manage to govern. And this is really important when we get to our 2021 election. So, in the Westminster tradition, the power to make law is divided between the Crown. So we still recognize the Queen in England as the head of our government, and the representative of the Crown in a parliamentary system that isn't in England is known as the Governor-General. Now, the appointment of the Governor-General is done by the Queen. However, it's upon the recommendation of the Prime Minister in Canada. So this is seen to be largely a symbolic role, but it does play a very important role when it comes to dissolving Parliament for elections, and it maintains that symbolic tie to the Crown and to Canada's relationship with the United Kingdom. Now, some of you might have heard recently that some former Commonwealth countries are removing the Queen from their governing structures. The place and role of the monarch in Canada is debated and has been discussed many, many times. It is unlikely that we will see that change in Canada, at least not in the near future. It would take a significant constitutional change, which is difficult to do in the context of the Canadian polity. So I think for the time being, the Crown is probably pretty safe in Canada, and our Governor General will continue to play the type of role I'm going to discuss. The second important element of how we make law in a parliamentary system and in Canada relates to the House of Commons. And when we talk about the Prime Minister and Cabinet and the decisions of the government and the ministries of the government, we are really talking about what happens in the House of Commons. So the House is elected. We have ridings across Canada, and we elect individual members of Parliament. But political parties play a very, very important role in how our House of Commons is structured. I'll come back to that in just a moment. Of importance, however, is also our Senate. So this is called a bicameral legislature, and it's not unusual around the world to have a house. So if you think about the United States, they have the House of Representatives, and to have a second decision-making house or place within your parliament. In Canada, much like the United States, it's named the Senate. What is very, very different between the House of Commons and the Senate is that our Senate is not elected. It is appointed by the government. It has also become the case since 2015 that the role of political parties within the Senate, well, it's still significant. What the Trudeau government attempted to do was to make it less significant, so that senators would be seen to be people who are offering what we call sober second thought on the legislation of the government. They're there to balance out some regional differences, and once you're appointed, you are a senator until you reach the age of 75. So they tend to be part of the parliament for a much longer period of time than your elected members of parliament. Not always, but in general, that would be the case. So when people constructed Canada constitutionally, the attempt was, of course, to maintain the relationship with the Crown. We were a Commonwealth state, to have an elected body that would be seen to be representative of the people, and to have that sober second thought vested in the Senate. All three of these parts must agree for legislation to happen. So the House of Commons typically proposes a bill. It goes through a series of committee meetings and revisions. Assuming it passes at the House of Commons, it makes its way to the Senate, where it will also go through a series of committee hearings. It might even have suggested revisions, which would then go back to the House of Commons. Once passed by the Senate, it is sent to the Crown, our Governor General, and that individual gives what we call royal assent. That is when a law becomes official in Canada. So I said I want to come back to the individual members of Parliament, because this is important to understand when we talk about what happens in Canada's elections. Every riding, and there are now 338 in Canada, has the opportunity to send a member to the House of Commons. People do not have to have a party affiliation to run for election, but the practical matter is you would be very unlikely to be elected in a riding if you weren't also affiliated with one of the significant national parties. And more likely, you have to be affiliated with either the Liberal Party of Canada, what is the Conservative Party of Canada, or the New Democratic Party of Canada. There are a few anomalies to that. Canada's Green Party does hold now 2 seats in Parliament. They have held as many as 3. And there is a anomaly, I suppose, for most polities in that we have a party from Quebec that has a significant number of seats, which you will see when we start to look at that. But they are not a national party. They are effectively a separatist party, which in the long run would advocate Quebec's separation from Canada. So it's always seen as a bit of a unique feature for a federal parliament to have representatives elected from a party that does not want to be part of the federal system. So very, very interesting politics. We could spend days talking about Quebec and Canada and possibilities of separation. I won't do that today, but it is very, very fascinating. And it is it's one of the interesting parts about how Canada's political system is able to contain that kind of dissent still within a democratic forum. So it's very, very interesting. So what happens for us to have a government form is that we hold a federal election and everyone goes and votes who's 18 years or older. And when I say everyone, you will see that voter turnout is actually a significant problem in Canada. Typically, about 2/3 of Canadians vote, of those who are eligible. And sometimes it has been as low as, I believe, 55 or 53% of the population. Again, a fascinating discussion about why Canadians aren't going to the polls. But again, we don't have time for everything today. So what will happen is after an election, usually the night of, or if not very early the next morning, we know how many ridings have been won by which parties. So we have a very good idea if we are going to see a single party form a majority, that means they hold the most seats, or if we are in a situation where a party has more seats than any other, but they don't hold an absolute majority. You have to win 170 seats to have an absolute majority. In those instances, we say we have a minority government. So they're still invited by the Crown, our Governor General, to form government, but they are much more reliant on what we call the confidence of the House to maintain power. So what that means is certain types of legislation are viewed to be so important that they absolutely must have majority support in our House of Commons. That means they need more than 170 votes. The types of legislation that are confidence bills are usually money bills. So the federal budget, when the government brings it, if it were not to receive an absolute majority in the House, we would say the government has lost confidence. When that happens, the Governor General has sort of two routes. They can look towards Parliament and say, is there another coalition that would govern together and perhaps make this work? We've not seen that happen in Canada, where we have switched to a coalition government, because largely minority governments have already made arrangements prior to bringing legislation forward. However, there are instances when confidence is absolutely lost, and that does trigger an election. There is one other way outside of a spending bill like the budget. Members of Parliament can raise a specific motion of confidence. They can put to their colleagues in Parliament and say, I've lost confidence, how will you vote? If the government doesn't win 170 votes, we are also in a situation of moving to a federal election or looking for a different kind of coalition to run the government. The funny thing, or interesting thing, I guess, about Canadian political history in terms of federal elections is that we have a historical tendency to switch back and forth between majority and minority governments. And we have typically only seen two parties hold government status in Canada. The Liberal Party, or what was once known as the Progressive Conservative Party, is sort of morphed into a Conservative Party today. Not exactly the same over all of our history, but we can see this is largely a continuation. The New Democratic Party is often treated as our most important third party, although there have been times when they have held, as you will see, less seats than the Bloc Québécois, the separatist party. So again, one of these interesting little anomalies in Canada. But typically, that's who people are most likely to vote for, and we are most likely to see in a minority situation either a Conservative or a Liberal government. So, Canada's 2019 election. So remember I told you in 2015 we had a majority government, lots of celebration of Justin Trudeau, and then we get to 2019. And the government fails to win a second majority. Again, historically this isn't entirely unusual, but it speaks to a real sense of disappointment among the electorate. And there are lots of, ask 10 political scientists why Prime Minister Trudeau did not win a second majority, and you'll get 15 different opinions. So there is a lot of speculation, or a number of things go wrong in 2019 for the Prime Minister that affect his electoral outcomes. These again are things that we could spend many hours discussing. But it is worth taking a look at the results of that election so that we can have a comparison to what has happened most recently. So I hope that you can read this on your screen, and I want to walk through this a little bit, because the 2019 results are really, really significant when we want to talk about our 2021 election. So I mentioned briefly that we have ridings across the country where people vote. The type of electoral system, or how we vote, is known as the first past the post system. So that means a political party in Canada can win an election, be a majority government even, but not have the majority of the popular vote. So if I were to put that in a different way, the party with the most votes overall, if you counted all of the voters in Canada, does not necessarily form government. Now, this is because electoral ridings in Canada are not equal in the number of voters per riding. So you have some ridings that have more voters than others. There is an electoral commission that attempts to sort of balance out these regional distinctions and also rural and urban populations, but it's very difficult to do. As you know, Canada is a very large country, and our population tends not to be equally distributed. It is largely vested in a few large urban centers and then very scattered across the country. So let's just take a moment, and if I can draw your attention to the popular vote from 2019. So remember, Prime Minister Trudeau went in with 184 seats. We vote, and he comes out with 157. Remember, you need 170 to form a majority. He's lost. Now, something you might notice on your screen is that the last election will say 184 seats, and then it says seats before the election, and it's 177. A couple of things have happened. You do have people who move between parties after they're elected, and that occurs, so it can drop the number of seats of any political party and increase those for others. So you can see there's a little bit of movement between the Conservative and Liberal Party. It's also the case that there are sometimes ridings are redistributed. So when you go from one election to the next, it might be the very first time people in that riding are electing a member. So the numbers can be a little bit tricky when you just look at them, and particularly if you don't go back and figure out each and every riding. So we don't need to do that for our discussion today, because I want you to notice that the Prime Minister won a minority government, in this case, with 33% of the popular vote, that the Conservatives, then under leader Andrew Scheer, actually had a slightly higher percentage of the popular vote, and in fact it had gone up from the previous election. So even though more people voted for the Conservative Party, and you can see those numbers in the popular vote, it is still the case with the distribution of ridings that the Prime Minister held as the minority, held the most seats in Parliament and was invited to continue as the government. So a lot of people are unhappy with the first past the post system because they say it returns results that are not representative of how people vote. So the benefit of first past the post is that you know your electoral results immediately. As soon as they count the ballots, the person with the most votes wins, and you can go ahead and form your government. So there's an efficiency to first past the post. But for a lot of Canadians, because it continues to elevate a party that doesn't have the broadest popular support, that it's a problem. Now, very interestingly, one of the things that people suggest caused a fall in popularity between 2015 and 2019 for the Prime Minister was that in 2015, one of his election promises was to review the electoral system. That was to come back and look at first past the post, and maybe even to recommend a type of representative system that would return results that are more in line with popular opinion. So he's not the first Prime Minister to make that promise before an election. And what tends to happen, I think, is that he won a majority following it. There's very, very little incentive for a governing party, particularly one that holds a majority, to come back and suggest that we should have a different electoral system that would likely return them with fewer seats. So if you think about this, you can see, looking at the slide, that the New Democratic Party holds about, where's our percentage? They had almost 3 million popular votes, so almost 50% of the vote that the Conservatives received. You see that they have a percentage of around 16%, the Greens 6%, and there's even a People's Party, but I'm going to leave that aside for a moment. So if we redistributed our House of Commons seats based on popular vote, it would look very different. And in fact, in this instance, the Conservatives would have had more seats than the Liberals. So there's not really a built-in incentive, regardless of the promise made, for a Prime Minister to open up our electoral system. There is, if I want to be very, very fair, there have been a number of attempts to review the electoral systems in Canada, and when Canadians have been asked at the provincial level, they have actually come back supporting the first past the post system. So electoral reform, again, a huge topic in Canadian politics, really interesting, not going to be resolved in the near future is my prediction. So Canadians were unhappy, though, that a promise had been made, and in this case, the Prime Minister and his government did not even put forward a discussion of electoral reform. Okay, so just give you a second, you can take a look. We see what our 2019 results are. And I don't have to tell you what happened in early 2020. A global pandemic, a global crisis that we have not seen or experienced before, certainly not in the way that it impacts the world, given our interconnections and our reliance on travel in particular. I know Cuba's tourism industry was hit very, very hard. Canada actually also has a very large tourism industry. We also felt the effects there. But in general, the requirements of public health to, we say lockdown in Canada, I don't know if you say that in Cuba, but to send people out of their workplaces, to close down restaurants, to close a lot of travel routes, had a really, really huge impact. And Canada, led by the Prime Minister, now with a minority government, had to make some very quick decisions, and the decisions supported and pushed largely from what we would say is the political left in Canada, from the New Democratic Party, helped support the Trudeau government to bring in Canada's emergency response benefit, which basically paid Canadians at a rate of $500, up to $500 a week if they lost their jobs. So people didn't lose all their income. I mean, for university professors, we were very lucky. We did not close. We moved to an online system in Canada, and we were able to continue to receive our salary, and there was very little impact in terms of our income. But if you worked in a restaurant or in tourism, all kinds of businesses were forced to close or alter their business. There also was just less economic activity. So the government stepped in, I would argue, with a very good program. There were bumps along the way. They also brought in protections and support for small businesses and entrepreneurs who were really suffering with the economic restrictions. It allowed people to continue to employ their staff, or at least some of their staff, to try to minimize economic impact. They protected renters who were finding it difficult to pay for their housing, which could have been a national disaster, to be honest. As you know, Canada does not have a kind of environment where you can live outdoors, and people losing their homes was a real concern. So they were able to manage this very quickly, but it is expensive. It is absolutely expensive to run these types of programs. Now, for the political side, the Liberals enjoyed tremendous popular support for their income supports and their national pandemic policies. The Prime Minister was receiving top marks from Canadians for handling the crisis. And by last summer, July 2021, it looked like Prime Minister Trudeau really had overcome a lot of the issues that had beleaguered him during the 2019 election, and that he was riding a kind of wave of support across the country. And even where he was not personally popular, there was a lot of support for the federal government's approach to COVID. This is sometimes just too tantalizing for a prime minister who has a minority government, because it looked like he was in an excellent position if he called an election, which you can do during a minority situation. You don't have to wait for that 4 years, that he would win a majority. And I think there's a lot of discussion about having an election, but many political pundits, people who follow politics and have watched politics in Canada for many years, felt that this was really an opportunity for the Prime Minister to try to win a majority, as opposed to managing the COVID crisis further. So it was very tempting. And all the political polls suggested that the Prime Minister was really going to be able to do this. And on August 15, he calls what we call a snap election, like snap, because it's not required. It was really to go to the polls. So, what did the Prime Minister say about this? What the Liberal government suggested to Canadians was that we absolutely needed an election, that the governing party, the Liberals, needed to hear from Canadians their support for what was going to be a massive spending package to recover from COVID. So the government is literally going to be taking on billions of dollars in debt to try to recover from the economic losses suffered since 2020. And in July, we all hoped we would be talking post-COVID, but as you know today, we are not post-COVID, and the economic considerations and problems associated with COVID continuing to be a public health crisis means that the federal government is going to have to continue its income supports and is going to have a real plan for a national recovery. So the Prime Minister made this argument. However, the fact was many Canadians, even as they found that they were supportive of the federal government programs, did not feel that an election was necessary. And they saw it as an opportunistic move on the part of the Prime Minister. So the cost of a Canadian federal election, particularly in the context of COVID, where you have to have a lot of public health supports, was estimated to be about $600 million. So it is costly. One of the things that became fairly apparent after the August 15 call was that this was not going to be an easy election for Prime Minister Trudeau. Part of that was because at the same period, you will recall, the Americans and other international forces withdrew from Afghanistan and the Taliban returned to power. Canada had already removed most of its troops, but the government came under fire for failing to provide safe haven and exit for Afghani citizens who had worked with our forces and who are now facing reprisal from Taliban leaders across the country. So the government looked very unprepared for this. And then domestically, I think you will probably know this. I don't know that it's the same in Cuba, but in Canada there has been a growing, I would say, right-wing movement that is anti-vaccination, it is anti-masking, it's anti-immigration, pretty much anything that you would associate as the good of Canada, they are against, if I could be slightly simplistic. What happened in our federal election, though, was almost unprecedented. The Prime Minister faced massive protests when he did have in-person election events. There was violence at these rallies and gatherings. Politicians, not simply from the Liberal Party, but across the Conservative and NDP parties, in their ridings were threatened, and in some cases threatened with physical violence at their gatherings. So we saw a real change in the tone and tenor of a Canadian election. When these things started to combine, and with that overall feeling that we didn't need an election, we started to see support for the Liberal Party really go into free fall. And in fact, there was a period of time, about 2 weeks in, where commentators started to wonder if Erin O'Toole was going to win a majority government. Now, for people who were on the progressive side of Canadian politics, O'Toole is a very controversial figure. We're not entirely sure where he stands, but he was not willing to enforce mandatory vaccination for people in his party. He's not seen to be someone who would adopt progressive policies. So this probably, the fear of Erin O'Toole's success is probably what saves the Prime Minister to a certain extent. There's also the fact that the election becomes overtaken so much so with the sort of sensational elements of the protests and the very difficult situation in Afghanistan, that the Liberals' other political platform issues, things like national federal programs to support daycare, pursuing meaningful reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, addressing climate change, most of those things fell off the radar. Okay, let's take a look at those results from 2021. So this is just a quick slide, and then I'm going to come back and we can look at the full comparison. Because remember, these elections are only a year apart. So we had all of this drama, all of this excitement, all of this critique about an election, and then the voters made their decisions. Slightly lower turnout. We went down to 62% of turnout from 67% a year earlier, which was unfortunate, but not surprising given public health restrictions. And we find that Canadians basically returned the same results as we had in 2019. So this really supports the notion that the election was unnecessary, and it also really puts to question the Prime Minister's assertion that he needed an election because it appears that Canadians were relatively happy with what was happening in terms of the management of the minority parliament. So actual percentages, both the Liberals and the Conservatives in terms of popular vote dropped slightly. The Bloc Québécois increased slightly. The New Democratic Party slightly. The Greens completely collapsed for a variety of different reasons in this election that, again, is a different discussion. And something for people to just tuck away in the back of their minds as we move forward with Canada's politics, there was a slight increase to 3% for the People's Party. This is seen to be a very, very right-wing, reactionary party in Canada, and we probably have not we've not seen this level of politics around anti-immigration, sort of a very libertarian approach in our history. Now, hopefully this is part of a protest vote as opposed to an actual trend in the country. So let me just advance to the next slide here where we can see these more in comparison. So 2019, 2021, and you can see the actual comparisons side by side. Canadians were often teased about being great compromisers. In some ways, this is a very, very Canadian election result. We chose to change very, very little. Now this will, I will just go to the next slide just to give you the rest of the comparison. Again, the real changes here, the Green Party is not really related to the election as much as to a failure of leadership within their own party. And the only significant increase that you can track is only a mere 2% for the People's Party. So we're not really seeing, from a political science perspective anyway, we're not seeing huge shifts in terms of what people wanted. So let me return then to my question. Was an election necessary? I will tell you the whole truth. I was inclined to argue in August that an election was necessary, that we were going to see massive spending on the part of government, and that it was a good time for the Prime Minister to check in or at least to test the waters. I would now tell you that I was wrong. I think what actually transpired during the election was not significant discussion about a post kind of COVID economy, that it became very, very focused on COVID and vaccinations, and that we lost a lot of time and energy and support among progressive Canadians to really embrace what kind of future economic recovery we could have. So it ended up being a very dull, in some ways, election in terms of public policy. Of course, it was exciting because of the very big things that were happening. But in terms of debate between the leaders or real discussion on public policy, I think it was very, very disappointing. And as a result of that, I would say now that the election was definitely not necessary. And in fact, here we are in December, and the Prime Minister has still not even provided mandate letters for his ministry. This is basically how the government sets the goals for each cabinet minister. So if we were in the situation of a necessary election and a new mandate, we don't seem to be moving very quickly. Looking forward, do we know when the next election will happen? We do not. We know that it must happen by year 4, so we would be looking at 2025. There is always the possibility, since we remain in a minority situation, that the government could lose confidence. At this point, there is very little appetite among the Conservative Party and the NDP for an election. As you see, they didn't really make great gains in the last election. And within the Conservative Party, there's actually quite a bit of unhappiness with Aaron O'Toole's leadership, and there's a real struggle for a kind of political ideological approach within the party, so that's up in the air. And the New Democrats are just simply a smaller party now, and they have continued to fail to grasp the real imagination. Now, whether that's because of the leader, Jagmeet Singh, or if there's something else at play in the polity, that's going to play out in the next several years. We have significant domestic challenges that the country is facing. Many provincial economies, Alberta in particular, have been hit very hard, not simply because of COVID, but because of shifts in resource extraction, oil and gas prices. That tends to impact Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland in very drastic ways. So what is going to be the relationship of the federal government to support provinces that are facing a collapse of what is the structure of their economy? We're facing, everyone thought the election of Joe Biden and ridding ourselves of Donald Trump was going to fix our relationship with the United States. It has not. There is a significant desire to sort of, the Build Back Better plan that Biden advocates is very much tied to supporting industrial and financial development within the United States, and Canada heavily relies on trade with the United States. Everyone knows that there is a difficult relationship to China, and you will be aware that we have just recently seen the announcement of a political boycott. As a result, you might also know that Canada had to negotiate the release of 2 Canadians that had been held in China for a number of years. This has damaged relationships. And of course, questions around how COVID was managed in the early days of the pandemic and how long it took China to report those results continue to be a discussion and a difficult political point. And finally, I just wanted to highlight for people that the government of the day, we have a Liberal government, but we're in a position or a period in history where the need to fix Canada's relationship with Indigenous people, that is between settlers and First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, is really, really important. There is a significant portion of Canada's population that lives in conditions that are, they're unacceptable by Canadian standards, and they are unacceptable, I would say, by human standards in general. And how those are going to be addressed, as well as taking into account Canada's role and difficulty in understanding how the residential school system came to structure Canada's relationship, but also to build in an inherent structural racism with regard to Indigenous people, is really an important topic, and it is going to have to be addressed before the next election, or at least in part addressed before the next election, and it is very difficult. There's a lot of competing politics, And on the right, you simply do not have support for reconciliation in the same way that you would get from the Liberals or the NDP. So it's interesting, but these are very, very real issues for people who are First Nation, Métis, or Inuit in Canada, but they're also, or they should be, very important questions for settler Canadians like myself as well. If we're going to have a strong Canada in the future, we have to own our history. So hopefully that has given you some things to think about with regard to Canada. This is a picture from my backyard, and it was in the autumn before the snow came. I didn't want to depress you by showing you a picture of snow, but you'll see I'm wearing a heavy sweater. Gracias por todos. If there are any questions, please feel free to email me. Otherwise, I am very happy to say that I will be rejoining my friends and colleagues at Universidad de Oriente in January, and my students and myself and my program assistant Melissa are just so excited that we are going to be able to be back in Santiago and to continue this important work and conversation between Canada and Cuba.